Hello everyone, my name is Chandler Spangler and I am going to be doing a presentation on the criminal process and competencies located on the beginning of Chapter 7. So starting off, the beginning of this chapter begins with a case study. So this case happened on August 2nd of 1984 with Richard Morin, who entered the Red Pearl Saloon in Carson City, Nevada, and he shot the bartender and a patron 4 times each with an automatic pistol. He proceeded to walk behind the bar and remove the drawer to the cash register, and 9 days later arrived at the apartment of his ex-wife and opened fire on her. He then tried to shoot himself in the abdomen and attempted, without success, to slit his wrist. A few days later, while hospitalized, he summoned the police to his hospital bed and he confessed to the killings. This case was really a landmark decision that the Supreme Court ruled that if a defendant was competent to stand trial, they were automatically competent to plead guilty and waive the right to counsel as well as other trial rights. For the legal proceedings, he was appointed counsel and pled not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. The court ordered that he be examined by 2 psychiatrists, which determined if he was competent to stand trial. Both psychiatrists, they found that he was depressed and that he also both agreed that he was able to realize the charges against him and assist him in his own defense and give him testimony if called to do so. After the death penalty was then announced by prosecution, Morin wished to discharge his attorneys and change his pleas to guilty. The courts warned him of the dangers and disadvantages of self-representation. The judge also asked Morin whether he killed his ex-wife deliberately, to which Morin asked what he meant by deliberately. The judge then restated the definition of deliberately, and Morin described his mental state at the time of the killing of his wife as follows. I wasn't very concerned about anything that was going on as far as the proceedings and everything that were going. Now, as I said in the last slide, I'll say it again, this case ruled that the competency standard is the same for a defendant's competency to stand trial, competency to waive counsel, and competency to plead guilty. The court held that if a defendant is found competent to stand trial, meaning they have a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings and can assist their counsel, they are automatically competent to make decisions regarding waiving counsel and entering a guilty plea. So at the end of this case, there were some case study questions. The first one we'll look at is assume the court finds that Morin is not competent to waive counsel and that once counsel is appointed, the attorney makes plans to assert an insanity defense over Morin's objection. As a mental health professional, how would you evaluate Morin's competence to waive an insanity defense? First thing I want to address with this question is there is a lot of confusion with an insanity defense versus competency. An insanity defense is where we look at the person's mental state while they were actually committing the act. There's situations where people sort of black out or mentally somewhere it happens to disappear where they don't remember specific details or they don't actually remember committing the act. So their whole mental state changes during that time. That prevents them from really understanding what they did was wrong, to where they're found not guilty by reason of insanity. When we look at competency, when you're found guilty, this is more of competence to waive an insanity defense. This is more of you're looking at the competency of their understanding during the trial, the different events such as arraignment or plea bargain, having the understanding of the charges being brought against them, where someone has to understand the consequences of their actions. So I think as far as a mental health professional, for me, if I were to evaluate the competence to waive an insanity defense, I would just go back to the basics, truthfully. I would look at what the first 2 psychologists looked at, which is that they found him competent to stand trial. They determine that he was able to properly understand what he did. I look at the fact that he was able to call the police and confessed, as in he understood what he did wrong in that situation. So that's what I would look at. In the actual case, Morin was found competent and received the death penalty for the Saloon murders and a life sentence for the murder of his wife. As a lawyer, what arguments could you make for or against the proposition that at the time of the sentence hearing, he was incompetent to be sentenced or executed? So again, this kind of goes back to the first one for me. I feel like both these questions are very similar because, the execution part gets brought up. That's when he sort of shifted. So he understood the consequence of it. So I would say that, again, look back at the basics. He understood the consequences of his actions. He understood what he did was wrong. He wanted to try self-representation, which usually in most cases is very negative because you don't have the qualifications as well as the experience as your attorneys would have. Last one, what can you say about his competence to confess at that time? And what else would you like to know? Again, I would say the case is pretty straightforward. As far as his competence to confess at the time, he's the one who contacted authorities and seemed like he was willing to comply. It wasn't until the death penalty arose that he sort of changed his mind about some things. So that's that. This part of the chapter looks at the competence to plead guilty, which we've kind of already discussed throughout the presentation. To make a knowing plea, a defendant must understand at least 3 aspects of the criminal process, which includes the nature of the charge pled to, the penalties associated with that charge, and the rights waived by the plea of guilt, including the right to remain silent, the right to confront one's accusers, the right to a jury trial, and the right to a trial counsel. And this is determined by a judge at a plea hearing, usually called the arraignment. A defendant is not competent to plead guilty if a mental illness has substantially impaired his or her ability to make a reasoned choice among the alternatives presented to him or her and to understand the nature of the consequences of his plea. A person who goes to trial versus plead guilty has many aspects. Going to trial, the individual has to be able to decide whether to remain silent, whether to take the stand, confront accusers, and or waive the right to a jury trial. In Sealing versus Eisman, a person who pleads guilty not only has to understand the charge and its consequences, but also must be able to understand and waive intelligently various constitutional rights, in which the Supreme Court rejected the standard in Godinez versus Morin. This last slide we've kind of covered throughout the entire presentation, but these were some kind of key points. The competence to waive the right to counsel and to represent oneself. This decision deprives the defendant of a legally trained advocate, which they choose self-representation. This is usually not something many people pick. This is usually for very rare cases and usually does not end well for the person doing that because they do not have the proper knowledge and training to understand. I don't want to say understand. They understand enough to know the proceedings, but they aren't trained or qualified to, I guess, understand what's best for them or how to present themselves in a way that a lawyer must or would represent them, if that makes sense. The judge must determine that the waiver is voluntary, intelligently, and knowing without any coercion. So they must determine that this person is not being coerced to self-represent themselves. The defendant must also be aware of the dangers and disadvantages of self-representation, as we covered. And then we also covered the competency versus insanity defense, the difference between the two. And I believe that is it for this slide. This is my reference page for the PowerPoint. The first citation is in reference to the book with the chapter, as well as the page numbers. And for the second citation, that is a link to competency to stand trial in criminal law cases. It's very good. It has a lot of information, and if you get a chance to read it, that's great. Thank you for making it through with me for this presentation, and hope you have a great day.